So, how exactly did you two meet? Natalie's mother asked it so casually that I nearly dropped my fork onto her good china. My name is Jake Sullivan, I'm 27, and up until that Saturday evening, I had known my neighbor Natalie Brooks for exactly 4 hours. I'd moved into a rental on a quiet cul-de-sac outside Dayton, Ohio, a few months earlier, transferring for a job doing IT support for a regional insurance company, mostly to put some distance between myself and a college relationship that had ended messier than I liked admitting. I kept to myself, mostly. I knew the mail carrier's schedule better than I knew any of my neighbors' names until that afternoon when a knock on my door interrupted a Saturday spent doing absolutely nothing. Natalie stood on my porch looking apologetic, a physical therapist a few years older than me who lived 2 houses down, someone I'd waved to exactly twice since moving in. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but my parents are coming for dinner and I have a broken bookshelf and about 10 boxes still sitting in my garage from last year's move that I keep telling myself I'll deal with. Would you possibly have an hour to help?" I said sure, mostly because I didn't have anything better to do, and we spent the next hour hauling boxes, reassembling a bookshelf with a missing screw, and making the kind of easy small talk you make with someone you've just met but immediately like. When we finished, sweaty and covered in dust, she thanked me and, almost as an afterthought, asked if I wanted to stay for dinner since she'd made way too much food for 3 people. I agreed, thinking it would be a quick, polite meal before I excused myself. What I didn't know was that 15 minutes earlier, before she'd even knocked on my door, Natalie's mother had called to confirm dinner and, somewhere in that conversation, Natalie had let it slip that she was, in fact, seeing someone. It wasn't even really a lie in her mind, she told me later, more of a deflection that spiraled the second her mother asked his name, and she panicked and said the first thing that came to mind, which happened to be mine, since I was the last name she'd typed into her phone after getting my number for a delivery mix-up the week before. So when I walked into her kitchen that evening, freshly showered and completely unaware, I had no idea I'd already been cast in a role I hadn't auditioned for. Dinner started normally enough. Her parents, Diane and Mark, seemed warm and easygoing, complimenting the pot roast, asking about my job, asking how long I'd lived on the street. Then Diane set down her wine glass, looked between us with the unmistakable glint of a mother who smells a story, and asked the question that stopped my fork halfway to my mouth. "So, how exactly did you two meet?" I looked at Natalie. Natalie looked at me. For a solid 3 seconds, neither of us said a word, and in a house that quiet, 3 seconds feels like an eternity. I could see the exact moment panic crossed her face and something in me decided, faster than I could think it through, that I wasn't going to let her drown in that silence. "We met at Grounded," I said, naming the little coffee shop 2 blocks from both our houses that I'd actually walked past 100 times, but never once entered with Natalie. I told them I'd ordered a large black coffee, no room for cream, and somehow ended up wearing half of it down my shirt when the barista called out the wrong name, and I turned around too fast. Natalie, appearing horrified on my behalf, apparently offered me a napkin and her own unfinished coffee, since mine was now decorating my shirt. Diane's whole face lit up. "That's adorable," she said, and Natalie, recovering faster than I expected, jumped in with details of her own, claiming I'd asked for her number so awkwardly that she almost said no just to spare us both the embarrassment. But something about how flustered I looked made her laugh instead, and one laugh turned into an actual conversation that lasted until the shop closed. We built it together in real time, trading details back and forth like we'd rehearsed it for weeks, when in reality we were making it up one panicked sentence at a time, each of us watching the other's face for cues on what to add next. Mark, more skeptical than his wife, asked a follow-up question that nearly sank the whole story. "What day of the week was it?" he asked, because Natalie mentioned once she doesn't usually get coffee on weekdays. My stomach dropped. Natalie's eyes flicked toward me for half a second before she answered smoothly that it had been a Saturday. She'd been running errands and decided to treat herself, which happened to align suspiciously well with the fact that we actually were sitting at her table on a Saturday, so at least our instincts were syncing up, even if the facts were entirely fictional. Mark nodded, apparently satisfied, and the conversation moved on to safer topics: the neighborhood, my job, whether I planned to put up Christmas lights that year. Under the table, Natalie's foot found mine and pressed down gently, a silent thank you I understood without needing words. Just when I thought we'd cleared the hardest part, Diane leaned forward again, clearly not finished, and asked how long we'd actually been together, since Natalie had first mentioned a boyfriend to her back in the spring. My mind raced through the math, trying to land on a number that wouldn't contradict whatever Natalie had already told her mother months earlier. About 4 months, I offered, watching Natalie's face for any flicker of alarm, and thankfully she nodded along like I'd read her mind. Diane immediately wanted to know why, in 4 whole months, she was only now hearing details, and Natalie jumped back in, explaining that she'd wanted to be sure it was serious before making a big deal out of it, which apparently was exactly the right answer because Diane's eyes went glassy and she reached for her napkin again. Mark, still chewing thoughtfully, asked what my intentions were, a question that made Natalie choke slightly on her water, and I answered as honestly as I could manage under the circumstances that I didn't believe in rushing things but that I took whatever this was seriously. It was a strange sensation, defending the seriousness of a relationship that had technically existed for less than 3 hours, but the words came out steady, and Mark seemed to accept them at face value. Midway through dessert, Natalie's phone buzzed loudly against the table, and she glanced down to see her younger sister Megan calling, undoubtedly having heard from their mother that the mysterious boyfriend was finally making his debut. Natalie hesitated, then answered on speaker before I could stop her, and Megan's voice immediately demanded to know if I was as cute as Mom claimed, and whether we had any pictures together yet. Natalie shot me a look somewhere between apology and amusement, then held up her phone, angling it toward both of us. "Say cheese," she said under her breath, and I leaned in next to her, smiling for a photo neither of us had planned to take, sealing our 4-hour-old relationship into permanent digital evidence that would apparently be circulating among her extended family within the hour. By the time dessert arrived, some homemade apple crisp that Diane insisted on serving with vanilla ice cream, I had fully committed to the role, laughing at family stories I had no context for, nodding along when Mark described his fishing trips in vivid, unnecessary detail, letting Diane squeeze my hand across the table and tell me how relieved she was that Natalie had finally found someone who made her laugh again after a rough breakup 2 years earlier that I was hearing about for the first time in my life. When her parents finally left, waving from their car with promises to visit again soon, Natalie closed the door, turned around, and slid down against it until she was sitting on the floor of her own entryway, laughing and groaning at the same time. "I am so sorry," she said. "I told my mom I was seeing someone months ago just to get her to stop setting me up on dates with her coworkers' sons, and I panicked earlier today and used your name because it was the last one in my phone. I never thought she'd actually visit and expect to meet you." I sat down on the floor across from her, still holding a mug of coffee I'd never actually drunk, and told her honestly that it was, without question, the strangest first meeting of my life, but also somehow one of the more fun evenings I'd had in months. We spent the next 2 hours dissecting exactly how convincing our fake coffee shop story had been, laughing every time we remembered a detail we'd nearly contradicted, like two people comparing notes after surviving something together. The following Monday, still slightly stunned by how thoroughly I'd become a fictional boyfriend in under 4 hours, I found myself walking past Grounded, the coffee shop we'd invented as the scene of our fake meet-cute, and on impulse I went inside and ordered 2 coffees, texting Natalie to meet me there after her last physical therapy appointment of the day. When she showed up, still in her work scrubs, I slid one of the coffees across the table and told her we might as well actually meet here properly, since apparently it was already written into family legend. She laughed so hard a few other customers turned to look and admitted she'd been thinking about doing the exact same thing all weekend, but assumed it would be too strange to suggest. We sat there for 2 hours, this time without an audience or a cover story to maintain, just two people slowly discovering they liked each other's company for reasons that had nothing to do with panicked improvisation. In the weeks that followed, we kept finding reasons to see each other, real coffee this time, actual conversations that didn't require a cover story, and somewhere in there, the line between the fiction we'd invented and something genuinely developing between us got harder and harder to find. Almost a year later, at a small dinner celebrating our anniversary, Diane brought up the coffee shop story again, asking if we still went back to Grounded for old time's sake. Natalie looked at me, then back at her mother, and finally admitted the truth, that we'd never actually met there at all, that the whole story had been invented in about 4 seconds flat under the pressure of an unexpected dinner. Diane's mouth fell open. Then she started laughing so hard she had to set down her fork, telling us it was honestly more romantic that we'd built an entire fake meet-cute together under pressure than if we'd actually met normally at some coffee shop like everyone else's kids. Mark just shook his head and said he'd known something was off about the Saturday timeline all along. He'd simply decided not to press it because Natalie looked happier than he'd seen her in years. And honestly, he added, watching a man scramble to defend a fake coffee order under cross-examination told him more about my character than any real first date story ever could have. And honestly, looking back at that first dinner, at two strangers frantically inventing a love story detail by detail just to survive one meal together, I think some part of both of us knew, even then, sitting there trading invented details like old friends, that we honestly wouldn't have minded one bit if it eventually turned out to be true.